Welcome to Real Fake History, the show that goes back in time and imagines alternative paths that history might have taken. It's naughty, but you're going to love it. At any time, there are an infinite number of versions of the future. What would have happened if events had taken a different turn? I always think it's a reminder that what actually did happen was not inevitable at all. And our world, which we take for granted, could be so very different. 80 years ago, these planes were in the skies above Britain. Germany had advanced across Western Europe, and only Britain stood in her way. We all know how the story goes from there. How the brave few, the RAF pilots of Fighter Command, managed against all the odds to defeat the German Luftwaffe, leaving Britain to fight on. But things could have been very different. In early September 1940, the Germans launched an all-out assault on London, shifting their target away from RAF airfields. This was a mistake. It gave the RAF time to rebuild and regroup. But what if things had gone differently? Well, I've assembled a top team of historians and experts to come with me through the looking glass. Luke Pepperer, Joe Thomas and Victoria Taylor are each going to outline an alternative fake history scenario, explaining what could have happened had the RAF lost the Battle of Britain in 1940. Luke Pepperer, how are you doing?
Very good. Very
Ready
good
for this?
Here. Yes, I am, thank you. I think the Battle of Britain, obviously being such an important part of the British national story, British mythology, British memory, that victory, if it hadn't happened, and what Britain would have looked like, would be exciting to explore.
Joe Thomas, what about you? What do you make of the battle?
Well, I suppose I'm coming at this from a sort of actor's point of view, and I think it's interesting just how much of a part of kind of national mythology it is. It looms so large in our national consciousness, and I think it is interesting to look at history in different ways and say, well, if things had just gone slightly differently, what would have happened? And I think counterfactual history is really, really fascinating stuff.
Victoria Taylor, you spend most of your days in archives finding out what actually did happen. Are you nervous about thinking about what might have happened?
It's quite chilling to see those different plans and different ideas that could have come about. And also the fact that, you know, a victory is made up of thousands of failures as well. And it's just interesting to see which failures would have been particularly pivotal in changing the course of history.
Well, thank you all very much for joining me. Let's embark on this adventure and imagine what would have happened if Britain had lost the Battle of Britain.
It is the summer of 1940, and waves of Nazi bombers are crossing the Straits of Dover, whilst the pilots of the Royal Air Force attempt to intercept them. Fighting is fierce in the skies over southern England, as the outnumbered RAF struggle to maintain air superiority and prevent German bombers targeting their air bases and critical infrastructure. On the 13th of August 1940, Reich Marshal Hermann Goering orders Adlertag, an all-out assault against the RAF bases defending southern England. Britain's secret weapon, radar, is destroyed by Stuka dive bombers, leaving the RAF blind to incoming Luftwaffe attacks. In a devastating blow, massed German bombers break through and knock out all of 11 Group's key airfields, destroying hundreds of RAF fighter planes on the ground. Running low on planes and pilots, the RAF is forced to pull back its exhausted frontline forces to protect England's industrial heartlands. By late summer, Britain has lost control of the skies.
So the RAF have been destroyed, its airfields are smoking ruins. Joe Thomas, what happens next? What is the real fake history scenario that you're going to give us?
So Britain has lost the Battle of Britain. So that means that the Germans now have air superiority. So that means that Operation Sea Lion, which is the name for the invasion of Britain by Nazi Germany, can go ahead. So that's 60,000 plus troops, 3,000 paratroopers, over 4,000 horses as well, and also underwater tanks, underwater panzers, so submersible tanks that can go along the seabed of the English Channel. All of that is now going to invade Britain.
That's the scenario. Let's take a look at what our future alternative universe history presenter might have made of it.
September 1940, and the RAF has been defeated by the German Luftwaffe, giving Germany control of the skies. Across England, ports and airfields lie in ruin, following a bombing campaign that leaves Britain vulnerable to invasion. Germany launches its attack by sea and hits the beaches of southern England, the largest invasion of its kind since 1066. But, though Britain's air force is in ruin, the might of the Royal Navy and her coastal defences is more than a match for the Nazi war machine. Hitler's forces are hounded in the Channel and repelled from their landing grounds on British beaches. By autumn 1940, the German juggernaut is halted and the Wehrmacht defeated. But the question is, will Britain fight on?
So, Joe, there we have it. The Royal Navy, the biggest navy on earth. They halt the invasion. Tell us, how did it happen?
Well, the Royal Navy was 10 times the size of the German Navy. And Hitler did have a plan, I think called Z Plan, which was to try and achieve naval parity with Britain. But that was only ever going to happen by about 1944 to 46. And that was Hitler's own, presumably quite optimistic estimate. So the Royal Navy becomes the thing that saves Britain.
Yeah, well, the British were quite prepared for an invasion. I mean, that was what they thought was going to happen. So there's barbed wire put on the beaches, there's the Home Guard is readied, people are told what they should do in the course of an invasion. Churchill is even prepared to use quite wicked and dastardly weapons on the Germans, things like mustard gas.
And that's if the Germans even managed to get to the beaches. But Victoria, you think the Navy would have just intercepted them, they wouldn't even got within swimming distance of the White Cliffs of Dover. What about the Luftwaffe? They've got control of the skies. Why wouldn't they have just cleared the way for the fleet to come across the Channel?
It's possible that the Luftwaffe could have made it a little bit more difficult for the Royal Navy, although it lacked that real sort of naval aviation element. You know, Goering had really sort of hoarded all these resources from the Kriegsmarine, from the German Navy for the Luftwaffe, but had ignored that section. So the Luftwaffe would have had to make sure that it had the right tools to attack the Royal Navy.
It's not the easiest thing in the world just to drop a bomb on a ship that's going along at 26 knots, 10,000 feet below.
Yeah, I think the Germans definitely did overestimate perhaps the power of the Luftwaffe. I mean, even crossing the Channel by the time they were near or over Britain, most of their planes were running out of fuel. And the Navy anyway, and the real history being the unsung heroes of the Battle of Britain, making those daring raids and destroying the barges and all that kind of stuff, a real important part of the British war machine.
Joe, Luke, it's a good point, right? Barges. I mean, the Germans aren't exactly coming in; they're massive warships. It's all a bit primitive, isn't it?
Well, that's it. I mean, I've been sort of poking around on various message boards about sort of with like military history nerds, and one guy said the Germans just thought of this as a big river crossing. They are literally converted civilian barges. You know, they were really, really slow.
OK, so you guys are not super bullish about the German Navy getting those barges across, but imagine they do. There's a storm, weird stuff happens at sea, Joe. What happens if they do manage to hit the coast? Because their problems are arguably just beginning.
So pillboxes, maybe mustard gas. Also more outlandish things like literally creating fire in the sea, having these underwater tubes that would release petrol that would be set ablaze.
Yeah, there were rumours spreading, not only in Britain, but all around Europe, of the British essentially having these bombs which when dropped on the Channel, dropped on the water, would release this flammable liquid, which would then be set on fire, and there'd just be this huge firewall around Britain as part of its protection. I mean, whether they actually had this technology and this ability, I think is debatable.
Let's say they do manage to get across the Channel in these ridiculous slow barges. They do manage to break through the largest fleet in the world at that time. They get through the petrol on the water on fire. They get through the mustard gas. They fight their way onto the beach. What's waiting for them on the beach? Who's there?
The remnants of the British Expeditionary Force, who of course had been evacuated from Dunkirk. They would have also found the existing armies from Poland, from France, from occupied countries, from the Nazis. I mean, you know, the Polish already had 35,000 troops by the summer of 1940 in Britain, ready to get into the thick of it once more. But there would have certainly been regular troops there, ready to take them on.
Now, everyone likes to take the piss out of Dad's army, the Home Guard, but there are a lot of them. some of them World War I veterans. There were a lot of people that were ready to withstand that invasion.
Absolutely. Men who were aged between 17 and 65, so not quite the age in certain cases to actually have been called up, but also at an age where they could be useful.
Early 40s, prime of life, Victor, I think you'll find. No problem there. And Joe, some of their equipment was a little bit homemade, but still works. You want to be on the receiving end of it.
No, they're seriously lethal weapons in the right hands. So speaking of the right hands, this is a little thing I've made. This is a self-igniting phosphorus grenade, and these are produced in huge numbers. 6 million of these were made. This is a half-pint milk bottle. At the bottom there's phosphorus, at the top there's benzene, in the middle there's water, and there's also a rubber tube which would dissolve into the mixture and make it more sticky. The idea is that when you threw this, it would self-ignite, and then you get a kind of sticky, explosive, burning sort of mass of stuff. So it's an amateur weapon, but actually, in the hands of a force that numbers like 1.5 million.
Well, the propaganda was that these would be used probably against German tanks. So you have German tanks rolling up the coast, and then you have the Home Guard throwing these against these tanks and trying to take them out in any way they could.
You know what? In the ruins of Stalingrad, a lot of this German armour were taken out by things not much more sophisticated than that. So it's not impossible. But Joe, the ones that I can't get over their bravery would have been the ones that sort of volunteered to stay behind as the auxiliary units.
Yeah, an incredible thing to volunteer for. So what these people would do was they would, as the German line was advancing into Britain, they would remain behind enemy lines and basically hide. But it really was quite sort of James Bond-like in a way, or maybe James Bond, Basil Brush maybe, but they would literally hide in like abandoned Badger sets. I mean, it was really like that level of sort of guerrilla warfare.
They were prioritised as well. You sort of had that equipment that they were exposed to that sometimes even the regular forces weren't exposed to. So, having high caliber sniper rifles that could, assassinate someone from, like a mile and a half away, So they really had that emphasis, and they also had that diversity of, having both men and women involved.
I mean, I think it's suicidal bravery, surely lifespan measured in days. The kind of thing you expect to see more in the Japanese resistance to the Americans in Iwo Jima, Okinawa towards the end of the war might have happened in Kent in 1940. Extraordinary. OK, well, you guys, you've laid out a pretty terrifying, unlikely path to victory here. Do you think, Joe, Hitler would have risked it?
I'm inclined to think not. I mean, I think if you look at the way the Nazis liked to wage war, it was always really, really quick. It was like, right, and we're going, and it's surprise and it's speed. And if you look at what was happening in sort of even like May to September of 1940, there was a lot of kind of going back and forth, and like the army wanted a broad front to attack, but the navy said, well, we need to have a narrow front. And just the whole kind of timbre of the way they were talking about it suggests that really they just don't think it's... They don't think it's viable. They don't think it's viable, yeah.
Yeah, but, Hitler was a gambler. And you stand there in northern France outside Calais and you can see the White Cliffs. It seems so close. Napoleon stood there and said, let us be master of the Channel for just 6 hours and we should be masters of the world. Hitler must have thought the same thing.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned like the time period there, because actually it's probably not necessary to assume that the Germans needed to seize control of the whole of the English Channel. Some plans involve creating, in effect, a corridor across the Channel with mines on one side, mines on another, defended as best they could by whatever forces they had, and just keeping that corridor open for long enough to get those troops across. So I think if it was going to happen at all, possibly it was that narrow corridor of opportunity just for maybe 24, 48 hours. That's how it could have happened.
So Joe Thomas has been telling us about a failed German invasion of Britain in the summer of 1940. For our next scenario, Victoria Taylor, what are you going to tell us?
This scenario is if Operation Sea Lion succeeds. So we've got the Luftwaffe in the skies, we've got the Navy patrolling around the coast, we've got the troops landing on the ground. So it's this period of looking at how the Germans would have consolidated their rule and control over Britain.
So Victoria, you're sketching out the unimaginable, Britain occupied by Nazi Germany. Let's take a look at what could have happened.
1940, and having lost the battle for the skies, Britain lies at the mercy of the German war machine. Though her army and navy fight with courage, the onslaught is unstoppable, and the German stranglehold over Europe now extends to Britain. In the months that follow, the British government falls, cities are placed under military rule and the royal family escape into hiding. But though Britain is occupied and overrun, there remains hope that she will come to resist her oppressor, and with the forces of the British Empire behind her, break free and be liberated from the shackles of Nazi rule. Temporarily occupied and divided, will her people be able to reclaim their island?
Dramatic stuff. Victoria, how do the Germans go about imposing rule on one of their occupied territories, like Britain?
It's most likely that Germany would have imposed their rule on Britain rather in the same way that they had in France and in Poland. So there would have been an establishment of German time in Britain. There would have been a period of martial law. So anyone that could potentially oppose the German invaders would have been rounded up.
Well, Joe, Victoria mentions this rounding up of prisoners. There was a list, and you'd want to be on that list.
You did want to be on the list because it was the Nazi blacklist. So if you weren't on it, it meant the Nazis thought you were kind of a good egg. Noel Coward's friend was pleased that they were both on the list and said, these are the people you do want to be seen dead with. But yeah, no, it was about 2,800 people, and it was prominent people within British society who represented, I guess, an ideological threat to the Nazis, or just had influence and were not Nazis.
Yes, a Nazi official, Schellenberg, I think, who compiles this list of people. I mean, he's also looking at the British institutions and kind of drawing up, what are they about? What's their character?
I think it's people who today you might call influencers, I think. It's anyone who's a sort of locus of influence and maybe ideology that's different to the Nazis. Even something like the Boy Scouts, which seems a bit silly, would have been targeted as a potential source of resistance.
One very obvious source of resistance is one Winston Churchill. What do you think happens to him?
Winston Churchill really could have gone one of two ways. So there's the typical narrative of him potentially, sort of going down with a pistol in his hand and choking on his own blood and, absolutely shedding every last inch of blood, sweat and tears for Britain. But there's also the sort of different opportunities of retreating to his bunker and sort of seeing if he can continue the fight from there, or if it's a case of trying to flee to another country.
He did claim that the story of this Long Island not come to an end until each one of us talking about his cabinet was on the ground choking on their own blood. So he was saying that he was going to stay and fight.
Well, typical bombastic sort of Churchillian rhetoric, but we know that actually he was, in his character, a bit of a warmonger. He writes actually when he's a young soldier, fighting first in the Boer War and then obviously in World War I, he writes, I believe, to his mother, saying that he's excited to go to war not in spite of the dangers, but because of them. So this is a character who, throughout his life, loves the war games and he loves being on the battlefield. And it's very possible that he could have gone down, as he boasted, in a blaze of glory. Either that or he's imprisoned and executed, which I think is also another possibility, because he's certainly, if he's not at the top of Schellenberg's Black Book, he's definitely in the top 5.
What about the royal family, Joe? What would they have stayed behind, do you reckon?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the royal family, because you've got the Duke of Windsor, who has often been sort of accused of basically rather liking going and toadying up to Hitler. So he's somebody who I think maybe the Nazis might have looked at as somebody to kind of bring into their orbit. I think the Nazis quite liked having sort of celebrity supporters.
Yeah, because he and Wallace Simpson actually make a trip to Germany in 1937, and they're inspecting the German troops, actually praising him as this sort of great rebuilder of Germany.
And of course the Germans wanted this sense of legitimacy as well, and even though, of course, there's the abdication crisis, he is the original king. Yeah. So, it is certainly an option that would have been considered by the National Socialists.
Somebody like the Duke of Windsor, I personally think they would have snapped up. I mean, the throughout the history of that party, even like Goering himself, when he first joined, he joined early, and it was a big coup because he was basically a famous World War I fighter, and they made a big deal of that. And I think that's why Hitler liked to have Goering right at the top all the time, because he was like this kind of national hero. Hindenburg as well, President Hindenburg, when they were coming to power, the day of Potsdam, that was a big deal. Again, a senior old aristocrat who makes you look legitimate and like you're not going to do anything really stupid and you're not really that grubby, and after all maybe it won't be that bad. The Nazis love people like that, so I think that I'm not saying that that's the road that the Duke of Windsor would have gone down.
They would have wanted him.
They would have loved it. They would have been up for it.
But Victoria, there was a plan to snatch the royal family and spirit them away across the Atlantic?
Yes, there was Operation Coates. So this was an operation of having 4 different fortified houses in order to take the royal family at a moment's notice. But of course it was made particularly complicated because they had to decide who they were saving and how they were saving. So the Queen always said that the King would stay in Britain. But of course that would have endangered the princesses, who are the heirs to the throne. So you've got this dilemma of trying to protect the King for, you know, the nation's morale, but also you've got the issue of trying to protect the future of the monarchy as well.
You know, there's a few second cousins, royal second cousins, trying to get on that plane as well, aren't there?
Yes, definitely.
So, Victoria, I think the Brits like to think of themselves as fighters, and Churchill's rhetoric sort of stirring up this national resistance campaign against German invaders. Do you think that's mythology?
I think it is mythology to a certain extent, but I think a lot of that has actually been superimposed. So my object is very recognisable. This is the Keep Calm and Carry On poster, which, you know, many people sort of look at in terms of being absolutely, you know, indicative of British stiff-upper-lipness and morale and keeping that sort of resolve, but it actually wasn't issued during the Second World War. So this was produced by the Ministry of Information in 1939, and it was sort of looking at bolstering British morale in the case of, you know, sort of aerial bombardment and eventually a Nazi invasion. And over 2 million of these posters were produced, but because they were never used, they were pulped towards the end of the war and ended up only resurfacing in 2000.
It's almost like we're misremembering aspects of the 1942. In fact, some of Churchill's most famous speeches, he spoke them in the House of Commons, but they were never broadcast to the nation.
There's actually a picture of him lying in bed recording them, but they weren't actually broadcast in his time. Like Dan says, he made them in Parliament. Some of it was spoken by newsmen, but people, you know, who were alive at the time swear that they heard it on the radio and that they were roused to protect their country, fight for their country.
Absolutely, and there's this sort of sense with Churchill that, you know, he's this amazing sort of off-the-cuff speaker, and of course he is an amazing orator, but, you know, a lot of it is pre-prepared, a lot of it's recorded after the time he's meant to have given the speech, so it is absolutely perfectly choreographed to be as impactful as possible.
Well, Victoria Taylor, thank you for outlining the unimaginable. Britain falls under the Nazi yoke. So after a summer of brutal combat in the skies above Britain, the RAF's been defeated, but that wasn't necessarily the precursor to more violence, was it, Luke Pepperer?
No, although German air superiority has been established and the British airfields are little more than ashes, the British, instead of wanting to fight on, decide to negotiate a peace.
Let's take a look at how that might have happened.
In winter 1940, the situation looks perilous for Great Britain. All of Western Europe has fallen to the Blitzkrieg, and the Royal Air Force is destroyed by relentless Luftwaffe attacks. German bombers pound London day and night, levelling great swathes of the city. With her skies defenceless and her people under siege in their own homes, the British government seeks terms for a cessation of hostilities with Herr Hitler. And a historic treaty ends the conflict between these two great nations. But will the peace last?
Luke, what kind of terms would Hitler have offered Britain?
Well, it really depends if he's thinking about what the Germans themselves had to suffer after the Treaty of Versailles, after the conclusion of the First World War. Of course, what really irked the Germans was not only the reparations they had to pay and also the loss of their economic power, but the war guilt clause. They had to take responsibility, economic, political, financial, and of course moral responsibility for the First World War. They actually felt betrayed by their European cousins, and life became very, very grim. So whether Hitler would have wanted to effect a kind of revenge on the British people, or because he loved Britain, would he actually have taken it easy on them?
Yes, he was a bit of a fan of Britain, wasn't he?
He was a complete Anglophile, even before he writes Mein Kampf, even before he has any kind of political power. He's talking about his admiration of Britain, and he's writing about his admiration of Britain. Not only are they formed of good Anglo-Saxon stock, which obviously fits into his Aryan narrative, but also the way in which the British have been able to bring under their control huge swathes of the globe in the form of the empire, from Africa to India to the Far East. Hitler greatly admires this. And don't forget, he'd actually fought as well against the British in the First World War. So Hitler had seen firsthand the ability and the capacity, not only of the British people, but also of the British war machine and of the British political establishment as well.
And he made a direct appeal, didn't he?
He made several direct appeals. It's interesting, even after war is officially declared by Chamberlain in 1939, and as late as July 1940, Hitler makes a speech in the Reichstag called A Last Appeal to Reason. Now, copies of this speech or transcripts of this speech are actually airdropped over Britain. And here comes one of them now, down into my hands. And it's just a transcript of the entire speech. And now it's really long and really dry and really, really boring. So the British public don't even take the time to read it. In fact, a second copy of the speech, an abridged version, is also dropped, and it is hoped that the British people will take to that abridged version. But again, they don't. Some of the British public are even using this speech as toilet paper.
He should have used Twitter, like any other self-respecting autocrat. Joe, but there are elements of the British establishment that are pretty pro-Hitler.
Yeah, I think there were people who were prepared to see Hitler as not necessarily benign, but kind of almost an inevitable thing that was going to happen and not completely bad. Like, just it's quite good to have a strong Germany again. Also, throughout the 1930s, Hitler just lied through his teeth constantly, saying that all he ever wanted was peace. And that I think there were people enough who were prepared to believe him. So there were influences within Britain who I think probably would have been prepared to countenance a peace with Hitler. Whereas I think Churchill was a bit of an outlier in that respect, and Churchill basically said, we might as well fight until the very end, because making peace is going to be no better than that. And I think that's kind of an argument that, like, most of us now would say is the right one. I think any sort of peace with Hitler just seems, in a way, completely revolting just because of who Hitler was.
I think if we're talking about peace, obviously one of our earlier scenarios was occupation. That's a lot more brutal than a peace ordinarily would be.
Yeah.
One of the interesting questions is actually, in a peace, what happens to a figure like Churchill? Because in a brutal occupation, he's either imprisoned or executed, or he dies choking on his own blood. But in a peace, I mean, it's very possible that he certainly resigns, but whether he goes into a kind of retirement or he in fact flees to America and becomes a kind of a British de Gaulle. I can see Hitler as well, after bringing Britain to the negotiating table, staying in Britain, making Britain actually the political and economic centre. And Hitler himself, he was eyeing up Blenheim Palace as his official residence. And you can almost imagine him putting Churchill, if Churchill hasn't fled by then, him putting him sort of in a butler's uniform or something and having him strut around serving Hitler and his cronies.
He would have been a bloody
drinks.
terrible butler.
Exactly, bringing him and Hitler and his cronies drinks. I mean, in terms of a real peace settlement, I think it's likely that actually one of the more pro-peace politicians would likely have been the one negotiating with Hitler on those terms.
So if Churchill was captured or, sort of imprisoned in occupation, the Germans would have had a real dilemma on their hands. They would have either had, kill him horribly and make an example of him, but then also would that have made him a martyr for the resistance? So you kind of have the issue of what could they have actually feasibly done with Churchill, whereas in a peace deal that actually might have been more preferable to the Germans, because then, it's either that they can try and oust him or replace him with someone else, and then he's not their problem in the same way.
And I think also for the British people, a very, very different idea and a very, very different perception of British national character, which obviously is formed by beating back, Fritz and the Jerrys and all this type of thing.
Yeah.
I wonder what Hitler would have asked for in the negotiations about the status of the German physicist living in London, like Leo Szilard, who was working on the nuclear bomb at the time.
It's very possible that actually in a peace scenario, the Germans would have had a good chance of developing the atomic bomb before the Americans, and obviously way before the Russians anyway. Might that have forced the hand of the Americans to come in? How long-lived would peace have been Probably not so.
Well, and you mentioned the Soviets. We should point out that Hitler would have had his objective, turning to war in the East with no undefeated enemies on his western flank. Do you think the war would have gone differently in the East?
If either a peace deal had been made or indeed there'd been an occupation of Britain, we wouldn't have had a blitz. And if we'd not had a blitz, then the Luftwaffe wouldn't have had to divert its resources away from its unsuccessful campaign in the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. It would have automatically had those resources at its hand and could have launched Operation Barbarossa even earlier in 1941 and, of course, avoided the infamous winter. So we never know.
So true. No British army in Greece in 1941, diverting German attention so they can start Barbarossa earlier, get to Moscow in time. I love what-if history. Luke Pepperer, thank you for outlining your case for Britain's peace with Germany. We'll never know what would have happened if the RAF had been defeated in the autumn of 1940. Perhaps the Home Guard would have seen off an invasion on the south coast. Perhaps German troops would have marched down the Mall. Would Churchill have been overthrown in order to secure a peace deal? They all seem incredibly unlikely given what happened. But it's worth remembering that if we go back to 1930, nothing of what followed would have seemed inevitable at that time. Britain's declaration of war against Germany, the rise of Winston Churchill to the position of Prime Minister, the success of the Royal Air Force against Germany. All of these events looked fairly unlikely at one point or another. And if history had diverged, as it could easily have done, things would have turned out very different indeed. My guests have made a convincing case for 3 different fake history scenarios that would have seen Britain fight on the beaches, fall to invasion, or strike a peace deal with Hitler. Luke Pepperer, Joe Thomas, and Victoria Taylor. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and it's got you thinking about what other what-ifs there are in history. Please do let us know what you think in the comments below and share your suggestions for episodes you'd like to see in the future.